I want to thank the leadership of this organization, the Miami Worker Center. In case you didn't know, this is a historic organization here in Miami that has broken ground on housing issues, human rights issues, and a variety of other issues, but from the get-go really was intentional about building unity between the Black, African American, Haitian, and Latino communities. And if you are from Miami, you know the value of what that represents. So thank you to the leadership of the Miami Worker Center, and welcome to their new home. This conversation tonight is part of a series of conversations that the social movements in Miami, and yes, there are social movements in Miami, so if you're not connected, today's the day, tonight's the night to connect. Organizations have been leading conversations around exclusion, racism, state violence, criminalization. I lead one of the organizations that forms part of that ecology, the Florida Immigrant Coalition. And we believe that we can come together for the fair treatment of all people. We also believe in the radical, transformative power of inclusion, whether that is access to human rights or whether that's protections and expansion of freedoms. And I invite you to look at floridaimmigrant.org to join and to connect. This is a special conversation tonight because we don't often have literary leaders and legal leaders be part of these conversations when we have them. And so it's special tonight. So for the next hour and a half, we're going to get a sense of what's going on in the Dominican Republic. From Heriberto Roman, who's one of the founding faculty members of the School of Law at Florida International University, and from two recognized and beloved authors, Edwidge Danticat, the author of Claire of the Sea Light, among many others, and Junot Diaz, the author of The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde and This Is How You Lose Her. We kept the bios brief, but we're very grateful to the three panelists tonight. Without further ado, the order of the program will be Heriberto giving us a lay of the land, where we'll look at issues of citizenship, statelessness, ethnic cleansing. Then Edwidge and Junot will lead us in a conversation, and we'll open it up for questions. In case people have to leave early, a very important piece of our social movement, in addition to building consciousness and solidarity, is creating action. Action to dismantle the systems of oppression. And before people leave, and we'll talk a little bit at the end, tomorrow there is a march. It's one of many different actions that are happening, or efforts that are happening, but it starts at 2 o'clock. And it'll go from the Dominican Republic Consulate at 1038 Brickell Avenue to the Haitian Consulate at 259 Southwest 13th Street. There'll be also a tweet storm that we'll be part of, but we'll go back to that at the end. I just want to make sure that for people who are leaving to know that this is part of an ongoing effort. Before I turn it over to the professor, we have a basket going around. We were, let's see, encouraged to get a security detail for this conversation tonight. Unfortunately, it's become so polarized. There's been a lot of hatred, as you know, being spewed. And the hatred is, unfortunately, not just in the Dominican Republic. It's sadly a global crisis that's also an opportunity to name and recognize that. So we are passing the hat for donations. We'd love to have $5 if you can. That will support the cost of the security detail. Thank you so much. If we agree, that would be great. The 3 objectives tonight, and I walked through a little bit, is really to deepen and advance our understanding of all of the dimensions of what's happening in the Dominican Republic. It's not just an immigrant issue. We want to deepen the understanding of the historic, systemic, and economic dimensions of the crisis. We also want to understand and name that this is part of a globalized, anti-Black expression that is happening, and we say it clearly and explicitly, and it's completely connected to the massacre in Charleston, to the killing of Black men, and the current moment of beautiful resistance and inspiration that we're living. And then the third item is to create solidarity and unity, in particular with sensitivity to the lives of women and girls. So those are the guiding principles, but we'll soon enough turn over the conversation to all of us. So, Heriberto, what the hell is going on?
Well,
¿Qué coño pasa?
That's a good way to put it, by the way. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the Center for not only organizing this, but being with these 3 amazing panelists in terms of the work they do, and just the turnout in terms of all the beautiful faces that are here, and just the sheer number. It's truly impressive. So I hope you would acknowledge yourselves at some point with respect to that. But let me bring it back in terms of what this issue is about, and I'm trying to address it in a way that's accessible, but also in a way that those of us here that may be versed in the law can have an understanding of it. And feel free afterwards, when there is a Q&A, if you have specific questions, feel free to ask me or the other panelists about this, because I'm going to try to set it forth. And I'm talking well over a century of issues in terms of violence and desperate treatment between one of those rare scenarios in the world where we have 2 countries sharing the same island. And there are other instances, but they tend to be satellite aspects of these countries, and that's in part some of the tension and some of the vestiges of colonialism. But let me bring it back to the more recent manifestations. What we're looking at basically is something that occurred in 2013, where a new court in the Dominican Republic was created, part of a constitutional revision, a constitutional court. And in that decision, this was part of an ongoing process that was both in the domestic courts as well as the international courts, where there were issues with respect to the history of Dominicans of Haitian descent in terms of getting birth certificates or documentation analogous to that in terms of the ability to work, to go to school. So in this decision in 2013, the High Court of the Dominican Republic basically interpreted the Constitution of the Dominican Republic, and it was a changed constitution. That's the highest law of the land, the Constitution of that country, to say that basically the 2 classic forms, and this occurs in the United States as well and most Western societies, the 2 classic ways to become a citizen is to be born of a citizen of that country, i.e. if your mother or father are a citizen, you become a citizen, or the other classic way, and these are fancy Latin terms, jus solis citizenship, to be born in the land. And most Western democracies recognize that, and except for those that have had horrific histories like Germany and other locales in terms of that. So what we're looking at in 2013, because this debate was characterized as an immigration debate, the court basically held that anyone born in the Dominican Republic does not automatically become a citizen of the Dominican Republic. There's a problem with that, all right? The problem with that is the Constitution of the Dominican Republic said otherwise, okay? The relevant Constitution of the Dominican Republic, not the most recent one that was changed in 2010 that referred back to a 1929 Constitution, held that if you are born in the country or if you are born of parents that are citizens, you are a citizen. And there was a clause there that basically said, unless you are in transit, which was interpreted repeatedly to mean if you are a son or daughter of a diplomat. So what the court in the Dominican Republic did in 2013 said that the people that were there were in transit since 1929. All right? And I'm glad you laugh at it, because that's exactly what the Inter-American Court on Human Rights did when it addressed this issue in 2005. These are repeated efforts that the Dominican Republic has tried to alienate its own people because of constructions of hate and race and colonialism and vestiges of that. So they did away with this. They did away with just soulless citizenship. They did away with it, not just going forward. And a country has a right to do that, which would be absurd, but it has a right to do that. They did away with just soulless citizenship, birthright citizenship, not only for new people born, i.e. after the date of the decision. They went back nearly 100 years. They went back 100 years. So we have generations of Dominicans that viewed themselves as Dominicans in no other country other than the Dominican Republic. And just because one group of brown people are basically expressing hatred against a slightly darker brown people, right, in terms of the shared experiences of those groups. They tortured their constitution. They violated every principle, and I can list them all, frankly, every principle of classic statutory interpretation, constitutional interpretation, common law, logic, common sense, human rights, and have been sanctioned for this, but they don't care, because one of the consequences of what they did, and these issues are directly relevant to the U.S. I tend to ramble, so let me know if I go over.
I'm wondering if as you finish that thought, if you can just talk about what to expect in the next period,
right,
and then we'll transition.
That's exactly where I'm going. So what has happened basically, that they've left, and by Amnesty International's estimations and the reports they've done, over 200,000 individuals are left without any rights. And when you lose your citizenship rights, in one stroke of a pen, these citizens were made to be immigrants. And the narrative, both in terms of the Dominican Republic and other discussions, is that this is an immigration issue. It is not an immigration issue. It is a citizenship issue. It is a constitutional law issue based on their own laws, not based on principles in the U.S. Based on Dominican law, they are violating their principle. They're violating their constitution. They are also violating human rights norms. They signed on to the American Convention on Human Rights. They are violating every principle of that, against racism, against statelessness. When you lose your citizenship, you lose every right. And these people are left without the country they were born with and are going to be deported to a country they don't know. So they are going to be the worst of all people. And as some of you know, concentration camps are being built on the Dominican side. There are 7 in total in terms of the discussion to round up these individuals. And some of the most horrific examples of human rights violation in world history started like this, to basically silence a group, to make them an other, to remove them of all their rights. And what has happened thus far, they've been condemned by CARICOM, International Trade Organization. But then what happened is that the Dominican Republic and Haiti decided to engage in bilateral conversations, brokered by the U.S. By the way, no one knew what was going on in those conversations. And all we know, as a result of those conversations, nothing has changed. Okay, so in terms of what we do now, I think the other panelists will address some of those issues and those narratives, but also in the Q&A, we can talk about getting transparency to these issues and try to bring back the rights the people deserved in the first place.
Thank you so much. And we'll get a chance to have maybe a deeper questions. The purpose of this conversation beyond information is really to have a space of reflection so we can advance our understanding. There are some chairs that may be vacant. Raise your hand if there are any vacant chairs, because I know there's a couple chairs over here if people want to take a moment to migrate over there. Yeah, migration is a natural and historic phenomena. The forced displacement of people is not driven by racism, climate change, poverty, restructure of economy. And here in this country, there is also a vigorous state violence-sponsored or state violent-led detention and deportation machinery, of which some of it is driven by profit. Let's take a deep breath. And let's invite Edwidge to come and share. Edwidge, let's make believe that this is Perejil. 20 years ago you wrote about Perejil in the framing of the bones. What are your feelings about this moment that we're living in?
Well, first of all, bonsoir tout le monde. Je voulais dire tout le monde merci qui venu là après-midi pour supporter nous là. I think it's tough. Je voulais dire merci avec Miami's Workers Center parce que you fait programme là soir. Good evening to everybody. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank the Miami Workers Center. And I especially want to thank the professor and Juno. Juno's having a very busy week here, and he said not to talk about that, but thank you. The Perejil is a historical, I guess, artifact that I guess speaks to a little bit of sort of the fine line that we are trying to walk here. In 1937, during the massacre of Haitians in the Dominican Republic that was ordered by Trujillo, it was so hard to tell people apart that they were asked to say Perejil, and you could tell by the way I'm saying it, I wouldn't have lived. If people were not unable to trill their R's, then they were killed. But I want to, of course, we are living a moment of historical reimagining, historical scars. But I want to use my time to talk a little bit also about just what people that I speak to on the ground have been telling me to just kind of bring you up to date. So, of course, things are tense. A lot of people are in hiding. A lot of people are afraid to go out since this deadline has passed. And places in Santo Domingo especially that used to be very busy with different merchants and so forth are pretty much isolated. And a lot of people are returning by themselves, especially more recent migrants have decided out of fear that they're returning. And the numbers that have been thrown out range from 12 to 20,000 of such people who are quote unquote self-deporting. And a lot of the images you see a lot of women and very small children and people who look very disoriented when they get there. I think it's important to also point out that there are two situations here. There are two groups of people. There are the groups of people who are more recent migrants, people who have gone to the Dominican Republic to work, and then there's the group of Dominicans of Haitian descent. And people keep asking me, like, well, why didn't the people who are Dominicans of Haitian descent register sooner than the mass group of people that we saw? A lot of them didn't register sooner because registering in the regularization plan meant that they would have been saying, well, I'm a foreigner, that they would have been basically stripping themselves of this citizenship that is rightfully theirs by just showing up and registering as a foreigner with no guaranteed really path to citizenship. Another thing people have been asking is why there's such a silence of these states and local states and these larger bodies like CARICOM who were so vocal after the decision. And part of the reason is that they're deporting people themselves. And so they're not as, we're not hearing, say, from these states that were so vocal before, anything about recent events. They're also, what I'm hearing, that people there who say that the deportations are happening, and not the massive way yet, but that they're happening in bits, sometimes at night, but that they're happening to, like, any soldier on the street can pick up a group of people and just bring them if you look Haitian. And there have been reports of people saying that they even people with their papers, they'll tear up their papers and still send them back. Now, the reception centers that the Haitian government have been promising us still remains these empty fields with tractors on them. What is prepared is what the professor has said, is that these old forts, basically, that are like prisons that are on the borders, is probably what are these so-called welcome centers, is what a lot of people, will end up. So, to wrap up, we'll have a longer conversation maybe during the Q&A. But to wrap up, it's like all issues, there's so much horror happening in the world. This too can likely fade in the minds of people, and it's important to keep the pressure on. And if we don't, I think if we don't think this concerns us, we're crazy. And if we're not concerned, we should be, especially when we live in a town where most of us here came from somewhere else and would not have had the opportunities that we have had if there were, even with the sort of screwed up immigration system that we're always fighting here, but if there was no fight back, then some of us would not have had the opportunities that we've had. So it's important to keep the pressure on. And I was heartened to see that there was the march today or yesterday in the Dominican Republic where in spite of the fear, in spite of the intimidation, thousands of people came out and marched to demand their right so that their citizenship can be acknowledged. So we're asking the same of you. We're asking your solidarity. We're asking for you to keep this in the forefront of your mind so that it doesn't fade, because this horror, whether we're watching or not, will continue to go on. Thank you.
Both you and Edwidge have used your platform, your voices, and your pens to speak out, not just about this, but in broader on other issues. Can you just talk about what motivates you on that, and what have your statements been?
Actually, I think, first of all, thank you to the Workers' Center. Thank you for all of you who are here. I wanted to thank my colleagues, of course. Tremendous interventions, and every folk who made time to be here. Everyone who made time to be here, thank you so much for coming. Traffic was no joke. Yeah. First question I always ask, but this one takes even greater resonance. How many folks here are of Haitian descent? Anyone? How many folks here of Dominican descent? Good. Yeah, man. So I just returned from the Dominican Republic. I was there all last week during the period when the end of the waiting period. This was when, this was when supposedly the mass deportations were going to begin. Spent the week running around. I can sort of just give you a little bit of just on the ground description, and then just move into some larger comments that might be useful. Some larger comments that might be useful. First of all, the situation, people are politely describing it in various different ways, but in Santo Domingo, there is a state of terror. There's absolutely no question that there is a state of terror in the Dominican Republic, that this is something that has been promulgated and cultivated by the interface of political elites, by the interface of military and police, and finally, of course, by the elite-controlled media. Anyone who's interested in studying media studies, this is a nightmarish case in how local and quote-unquote indigenous media can be used to render an entire community terrified and an entire community silent. Many of the sectors that would normally be incredibly vocal and active in this front find themselves fearing not only for their safety, but for their family's safety. Many of the folks who early on in this struggle who were standing up to the Dominican Republic, the government's sort of insanity, found themselves having to flee their homes. Many of them found themselves having to go into hiding. Many of them found themselves receiving all sorts of death threats. And I think that what we must remember is that the global aspect of this that has been underscored here must be reiterated. That the Dominican Republic's activities are not in of themselves simply isolated. That this has taken a whole long time to get this nightmare on the road. And certainly the largest of the United States sort of, hegemonic bosses, the United States, has spent the last decade or so in just deporting people and shattering communities like it is free. And at a global level, this has been general. The immigrant body is viewed, even among many allies, as certainly not worthy of the kind of attention that would be brought to quote-unquote citizen bodies. Obama has been deporting folks for the last, God knows, 6, 7 years by the thousands. And Europe has built itself into an enormous fortress, all the bodies that are dying in the Mediterranean Sea, and you see the same exact things happening in Australia and New Zealand. All of the places that have fattened themselves with their asymmetrical neoliberal policies have now created this situation where the crime is not capitalism or neoliberalism. The crime are these bodies who are attempting to save themselves from the ruin inflicted by other people. So what we have in the Dominican Republic is, I think, an incredibly this is very, very, very important. What we have in the Dominican Republic on the island is what we have is kind of the perfect example of all of these tendencies, all of these trends intersecting. A national community, international community that has become totally indifferent to the rights, to the humanity of anyone they designate as immigrants. Whether it's North Africans, Africans, folks from Turkey trying to get into Europe, whether it's Asian communities dispersing by boats trying to arrive, whether it's across this one border, the problem remains that as an international community, the indifference to immigrant bodies is extensive. And I think Edwige's comments are really, really important, that across the board, there's very little political will, because the practice of immigrant hating is, the metaphysics of immigrant hating is very important to these regimes. Now, the local vision of this is that what is happening in the Dominican Republic is an action, it's a set of policies put into motion by a political party called the PLD, the PLD. The PLD has had power in the Dominican Republic for almost 20 years. The corruption of its leadership is legendary, absolutely legendary. They continue to find ways to get themselves reelected, and, for example, the next election, the PLD has made a pact with the opposition party, like literally has made a deal. You guys don't run against us and we'll give you X, Y, and Z. That's the kind of democratic sort of fragility that we're talking about. And what's happening in the Dominican Republic with this is that the PLD is mobilizing media and mobilizing many of its functionaries to conflate what it is pursuing, these super fucked up, just diabolically racist policies, conflating its policies, what it has spent 30 or 40 years engineering, with the Dominican nation. So it is wrapping itself up in the Dominican flag and saying any criticism of this party and any criticism of its policies is an attack on the Dominican Republic. And it has been incredibly successful at hiding its morbid, dread, rotting hand and turning this into these just baffling conversations about, well, y'all just hate Dominicans and y'all just attacking this nation, instead of focusing on that it is a group of people who have been trying to pull this off since the time of Balaguer. We had the demonic US-backed, post-dictatorship President Balaguer, who the US helped put into office, and Balaguer and his think tanks actually floated this idea back in the 70s, and even Balaguer, who was too terrifying, even he was a terrifying figure, he couldn't pull the trigger on it. He was like, this is too crazy. Like, for real. It says a lot about where we've come as an international community, where the stakes of human rights, where we all are about our tolerance for the massive deportation of racialized bodies, just collectively, that a nation and a political party like this can feel itself actually comfortable in trying to pull this damn thing off. And finally, you must know, of course, that Haiti is under occupation. Haiti is occupied. It says it's the United Nations, but it is the US. All right? Listen, Haiti's occupied, right? They have found enormous mineral wealth. This is not a conspiracy walking around. They have found enormous mineral wealth. And if you look at the triangulation of power, what's going on that poor island, all the folks that we're talking about, whether we're talking about undocumented workers or we're talking about Dominican citizens who this PLD is attempting to disenfranchise because just a few years ago, a local version of what we would call the Arab Spring occurred, what was called the 4% movement, where you suddenly had even the kids of rich families, you had all sorts of young people across the nation protesting against the government's impunity, the government's corruption, coalitions that you'd never seen with Haitian migrants, with rich kids from like the best neighborhoods, and they were all gathering together to attack this government, to attack this regime, and then a couple years later, they throw this at us. And it has been the most incredibly divisive, it has been incredibly successful as a wedge issue to shatter these nascent solidarities. And so when you think about it, and I'll leave it here, with the intersection of where these controls come, you have Haiti under occupation. Yeah? You have US corporations who are so deeply involved in mineral extraction on both sides of the island. Yeah? You have Dominican and Haitian elites who don't give a fuck about Haitians of any kind. They don't give a fuck. They feel more comfortable dealing with occupation authorities and dealing with corporations than they care about the bodies of the people that they claim to represent and serve. And when you lock these factors out, what we're looking at is not only are people being exposed by judicial fiat, not only are they being made vulnerable by judicial fiat, there is no sector besides human rights people and people on the ground doing this work who are defending these vulnerable communities, because none of these people have anything at stake. In fact, there's a lot at stake at keeping conversations of human rights away from an island where vast amounts of extraction is happening. The largest mineral corporations in Canada are on the island, just pulling gold out of there like it is free. And just so you know, Bonao, la gente de Bonao conocen bien, yeah, lo que está pasando Bonao, and we'll leave it here, just to show you the absolute sense that it doesn't make a difference. In their minds, they think that they have won. All of these factors, including the other Caribbean nations who want to be able to avail themselves of the same cruel impunity. Next year, when the community of Caribbean nations gathers, who is the host state? The very president who put this policies in motion, Danilo Medina, offered up the Dominican Republic as the place where all of these nations can gather and pat each other in the back and eat really well, and this group agreed. They just are completely indifferent. And this is why all of this matters. This is why if we do not begin to practice the muscles of having a possessive investment in each other's oppressions, we are in some serious trouble. And I leave you, I think it is no accident that the first, and I use this term not in our traditional sense, but the first nations of the New World, the first places that everything that we call modernity gets beta tested, the future of our destruction is being given a dry run. Because if you don't think what the Dominican Republic is doing in the Dominican Republic with these political parties, if you don't think a whole bunch of other polities are going to avail themselves of this, we must begin to practice the muscles, because it starts at the First Nation, and before we know it, it's happening everywhere. It already is, but you know what I mean. Thank you.